Hello and welcome back to Truly Tragic Transits with me, Rebecca Lovett, and I have little Bonnie, the dog, sat next to me as well, enjoying the stories. In today's episode, we are exploring the energetic story behind the passing of Steve Irwin, a man whose life was defined by risk, courage, education, and an extraordinary connection to the natural world. For those of you a similar age to me, I know you will know Steve Irwin. You will, if you're anything like me, he would have been a childhood hero. I can remember being incredibly shocked when I heard of his passing. And the world needs more people like him committed to the natural world. So it was a real shock to the system. This is a very different kind of story from the one that we explored in the previous episode with Caroline Flack, and actually the previous episodes in season 1 as well. Because this story is not about addiction, it isn't about mental health in the traditional sense, and it isn't really about recklessness either. This episode really is about instinct and purpose, and what happens when the lines between who we are and what we do as a job becomes almost impossible to separate. So as always on Truly Tragic Transits, I'm looking at 3 main areas, 3 things. The first one is potential energy. What is the potential energy in someone's chart? This is the blueprint that someone is born with. And when we look at readings and things, these are the charts that we're working with. The astrology charts, the human design charts. The second part of this is shadow triggers. This is the environments and the transits that activate those vulnerabilities that we already know are sitting within someone's chart. And the third aspect of this that I look at is choice and consequence, not in a moral sense, but in how a nervous system responds over time. What are the ingrained patterns in that person that require safety and understanding to be able to work with a pattern in a healthy way? And Steve's story shows us something really important, a really important factor that sometimes our greatest strength is also the place where we are most exposed. Sometimes our greatest strength is also our greatest vulnerability as well. So before we look at the astrology, I always like to make sure that there's some honest reflections around this, making sure we're looking at these people as human beings, because I think we can get into a really pathological discussion around this and take the humanness out of it. And I really don't want to do that. So before we look at the astrology, I really want to remember Steve Irwin as a human being, as a rescuer, as someone who did a lot for wildlife conservation, as someone who did a lot for education as well. I remember watching his shows and just being obsessed with the snakes that he would find, the spiders that he would find, how he could seemingly speak to the animals. I loved his energy. I loved his spark. And for me, as someone who had only really seen, at that time, had only really seen David Attenborough, and bearing in mind my experience of David Attenborough is him as an older person, so he wasn't as vibrant, as charismatic as I know my mum would tell me that he reflected more in his youth. For me, Steve Irwin was someone who really represented the dynamism and the enthusiasm that I loved to see shine through in people who were committed to conservation and committed to wildlife education. And someone who also does this for me is interestingly called Steve as well, Steve Backshaw, who I had the pleasure of meeting and working with on one occasion, which was one of the best days of my life. I loved it. And he was the nicest, humblest human being. Must be something in the name Steve. But Steve Irwin, he, I think, set the tone for what people needed to see from a wildlife enthusiast to be able to be enthused themselves. They didn't want to learn through books. They wanted to learn through someone getting their hands stuck in and getting their hands dirty. So I really have to give my full applause to, not that he's waiting, not that his spirit is waiting for my applause, but I really do want to make sure that, his work is remembered, not just his story around his death. So Steve Irwin, he was larger than life. He came across as joyful, warm, someone who could enthuse anyone about wildlife. And he lived his purpose openly. He lived it unapologetically. He lived it with a lot of risk involved, which ultimately he paid the price for, unfortunately. And he educated millions. He protected wildlife. He brought people closer to nature through that natural enthusiasm. And it was, this is actually something to reflect on really strongly, because his work was not about fear. Everything that I had seen up until that point as a child, I think I would have been maybe 12 or 13 when Crocodile Diaries came out. Everything that I had seen at that point was about fearing snakes and fearing spiders. And actually, this was a guy who was on TV showing us that we didn't need to be afraid. We needed to be responsible and we needed to be aware, but we did not need to be afraid of these animals. And a lot of the stories up until that point were really, really fear-mongering. So for Steve, danger wasn't a thrill. It was familiar terrain. Us watching it was really thrilling. But for him, it was just like, yeah, we run off adrenaline here. This is how it goes. And familiarity changes how the nervous system perceives risk. And I think this is a really important point to just rest on for a moment, because although we saw the risk in this person's behavior, for that person it was normal. And so when you train a nervous system to normalize fear, you don't see the same perceived risks as a person who was looking from the outside in would see. So this leaves a potential gap here for risky behavior to become normalized and for us to live from a more invincible space, which, as I say, ultimately was not a positive, at least in terms of tragedy. At the core of this, when we look at the chart, Steve's chart had two powerful forces at play within it, Mars and Neptune. Mars is a planet of action, of instinct, of movement, and of courage. And Neptune is a planet of mystery, the unseen, and what we can't predict. Neptune is a murky planet. I always describe it as a puddle that looks really clean until you stick your foot in it and notice that the water that I thought was clear and clean actually has a lot of dirt and a lot of mud and a lot of residual energy stuck within it. It's not quite as obvious as I thought it once was. Neptune really blurs those lines around clarity, because it ultimately never asks us for clarity, it asks us for creativity. So when Mars and Neptune, when these two energies are prominent, life becomes a dance between instinct and the invisible. Steve's chart shows this really clearly, and when we add in human design to this layer, it's a really interesting layer to add on. Neptune sits in gate 1, the energy of the creator and the initiator, someone who leads by being first. And Mars sits in gate 13, which is the gate of the witness, the carrier of collective stories and shared human experiences. And this creates a dynamic where action often comes before reflection. movement comes before pause, instinct comes before analysis. And you can see how this might be a slightly tricky dynamic to manage in the world where he operated. And both of these gates sit in the G center, the heart center. Well, it's not called the heart center, but it is anatomically where the heart sits, which is the center of identity, the center of direction, of love and purpose. And this is really crucial because for Steve, this wasn't just a job. It wasn't even a calling. It was just who he was. Neptune in gate 1, this is who I am. And when purpose lives in the G center, you don't step away from it. You embody it. You become it. A Neptune sign placement adds another layer, and I spoke a little bit about this. I think it was in the Whitney Houston episode, Neptune in Scorpio, because for everyone of that generation, Neptune will be sat in Scorpio. Exactly like for everyone in my generation, they will have Neptune in Capricorn. Neptune's a generational planet. Because Neptune in Scorpio really is the sign associated with life, death, mystery, and what lives beneath the surface. So if we think of Neptune as being the planet of the murky waters that kind of sit above, Scorpio represents the deepest, darkest depths of the ocean. This is an energy drawn to the unknown. This is a person, Neptune in Scorpio, especially sitting up opposed Mars. This is the energy drawn to the unknown, drawn to what others avoid, drawn to places where transformation is possible, but danger is very, very real. And Mars, meanwhile, was in Aquarius, acting not for ego, but for community, for education, and for collective good. So this wasn't about adrenaline for its own sake. This was about making meaning of it. Now, what's really important about the relationship between Neptune and Mars is that they're in a square in his chart. Now, a square creates internalized friction, internalized uncomfortableness around which one should I follow, which instinct should I follow. Should I follow the Mars, which is quick and sometimes irrational and a little bit risky, or should I follow the Neptune, which is softer and it is more intuitive and it is more let me take my time, let me bide this over. You can see how that internal friction would create quite an issue within someone, especially with this sort of pattern of behavior and work. Someone who needs to jump in and then probably feels the consequences of things later. But there's a really interesting dynamic going on there between Neptune, who is slower, who is more intuitive, more in tune, more about sensing and feeling things out, and Mars, which is headstrong, jumping in with both feet, taking risks, and ultimately deals with the consequences, whatever those consequences are of the risks. And I really want to emphasize that that's uncomfortable for someone to sit with. And what happens with squares usually is people don't learn how to balance the two. So they lean really heavily into one. Now we can see from Steve's story which one he lent into. He massively lent into that Mars placement. But what would have been really interesting to see him grow into would be the Neptune aspect of that Neptune square, which is, okay, sometimes I need to sense things out, sometimes I need to feel into them, sometimes I need to take my time with these things because they are not quite as straightforward as they may always seem. So every strength has a vulnerability, and when danger becomes familiar, alarm bells soften. Alarm bells are not ringing for someone who faces danger every day of their life. It becomes their new normal. Their nervous system adapts, and so what would trigger fear in others feels completely normal to that person. And this is where Steve's environment becomes part of the journey. He spent much of his life in Neptune realms, in the oceans, in wildlife, in unpredictable natural environments. Neptune governs what we can't see coming. It almost shrouds everything with this veil of secrecy, not even secrecy, this veil of confusion. You know, it distorts, it disorientates us. And the stingray that caused Steve's death didn't announce itself. There was no warning. There was no time to react. It was this mysterious, you know, if you think about stingrays, they blend in to their surroundings. They're not in the deepest, darkest depths of the ocean. They blend into their surroundings so that they can survive. And when they feel threatened, they sting. Exactly like a scorpion, exactly like where Neptune in Scorpio was sitting. That is a story within itself. Because when we talk about Neptune placements, Neptune does not shout, but it dissolves danger into the background. And sometimes tragedy isn't loud, but it is silent. There's a really eerie and spooky nature to this. Astrocartography adds another deeply symbolic layer into this. At the time of Steve's passing, and I find this mind-blowing, because at the time of Steve's passing, he was positioned astrocartographically, I think that's the word, between his Pluto line and his Venus line. Now, if you've never seen an astrocartography chart, it is your astrological chart overlay onto a geographical map. These places do not come up all that often. You don't see a Venus line that often. You don't see a Pluto line that often. You don't see a Sun line that often. So the fact that he was positioned in this really short space between Pluto and Venus as lines is really symbolic and really important to this story. Pluto and Venus are opposing each other in his birth chart, which speaks to tension between power and love, purpose and vulnerability. His Pluto line ran through his midheaven on his natal chart. So that means his Pluto line also represents part of his midheaven. And this is a point of public life, of legacy, and of life's work. This is activating themes of intensity, of transformation, and life and death stakes in the very place he was most visible to the world. Pluto here in his chart does not suggest recklessness, it suggests total commitment. And his natal Venus sat in Pisces in the 4th house was also conjunct Chiron. This is a placement of deep compassion and emotional openness, love without armour. But it also carries a quiet wound. And this speaks to someone who lives from the heart, who doesn't harden themselves against the world, even when they could. To love life fully without shields is beautiful and it is vulnerable at the same time. And Pluto opposing Venus brings that vulnerability into sharp focus. And this was where he was at the time of his death. And this is an important distinction to make here, because we talk about choice and consequence. Steve didn't make a bad choice. He lived in alignment with who he was. But living in environments where risk is real means that consequences don't always come with warnings. And we also see that Mars instinctive aspect comes out really strongly, but it's also square, that Neptune aspect, which leaves surprises and leaves things unseen, leaves us vulnerable with our eyes. We also see that on a astrocartography level, he was mega close to his Pluto line and his Venus line, both of those opposed in the chart, that represented life and death and transformation and public image, what people will be remembered for with that midheaven, vulnerability as well. And the whole concoction it gives me shivers, actually. It's the story. It's not bad choices. It is not bad things, too risky. It is the story that was always written, but we never knew how it was going to end. This wasn't about thrill seeking. This was about identity, his identity in motion, purpose, courage, and exposure all woven together. There's one more layer to Steve Irwin's story that is too important to ignore, and that is of the transits. Because at the time of his death, Steve was experiencing Chiron transiting conjunct his natal Saturn. He also had Neptune transiting his south node, and he had Jupiter transiting his Neptune. Now, these are really sobering transits in, or as we reflect on the story of his life. Because if we look at the first one, Chiron transiting conjunct his natal Saturn, Saturn represents the body, limits, morality, and the structures that hold life together. And Chiron represents a wound that never fully heals, and the moment that wound is brought into full awareness. So when Chiron meets Saturn, the story is almost always about the body reaching its limit. Oof, that gives me shivers. That sentence gives me shivers. When Chiron meets Saturn, the story is almost always about the body reaching its limits. It's a point where resilience meets reality and where endurance meets morality. And this transit often coincides with physical vulnerabilities, injuries, a confrontation with limitation, or the surfacing of a long-standing weakness in the system. Symbolically, this is the archetype of the wounded elder, the hero discovering that even strength has a breaking point. This doesn't mean that Steve was meant to die, and I really need to emphasize that I don't believe that transits predict death, but I do believe that they give an element of understanding what the soul's story and the soul's journey was meant to be at that time. Because it doesn't mean that he was meant to die, but it does mean that energetically his body was in a phase of heightened vulnerability. Exactly at the time he was still living fully in environments full to the brim of real physical risks. And at the same time, so we have this transit going on, and at the same time Steve had Jupiter transiting conjunct his natal Neptune. We have spoken a lot about natal Neptune in this podcast. This is a beautiful but dangerous combination because Jupiter expands whatever it touches and Neptune dissolves boundaries and blurs perception. So together, this transit creates heightened faith, heightened optimism, a heightened sense of meaning and protection, and unfortunately, a heightened blind spot as well. Because this is the energy of everything will be okay, I am protected, I trust life completely. In spiritual language, really, this is divine trust and divine faith. But in physical reality, it can become overexposure pretty quickly. And this transit often shows up when someone feels invincible, when they feel guided or held by something larger than themselves. And it is luminous, but it can also lower the body's natural alarm system. And as we've spoken about through this podcast, Steve's alarm system was probably already largely dissolved anyway. And finally, this last nail in the coffin almost, Steve had Neptune transiting conjunct his natal south node. So we've spoken a lot about natal Neptune, but this is transiting Neptune now, which is conjunct his natal south node. And this is one of the most karmic transits a person can ever experience. Not everyone is going to get one of these transits within their lifetime because Neptune takes 164 years to move around the birth chart. Not everyone's going to get that opportunity to feel that, because it might only happen once every 164 years, depending on where the South Node sits and where Neptune is when that person is born. And the South Node represents past life energy, familiarity, familiar identity, and old patterns of being. And Neptune represents dissolution, surrender, and a return to the infinite. Neptune rules Pisces, which is the last sign of the zodiac, so it has this real representative energy of endings. So when Neptune meets the South Node, there is often a sense of completion, of spiritual release, a fading out of a role, or stepping beyond the physical story altogether. This transit is frequently seen in charts around deaths, retreat from life, or profound spiritual surrender of some description. And it doesn't create death. I have to emphasize this because people get very fear-mongery around certain patterns in astrology. It does not predict death, it doesn't create death, but it does symbolize the soul loosening its grip on this incarnation. That could look like a brilliant and beautiful shedding in the physical realm. It does not have to mean death. So please, if you see that in your chart and you see that conjunction coming up, please don't fear that conjunction, but be aware of what lessons it might be bringing. And, Neptune conjunct South Node is the archetype of going home. I'm going home. Wow. So when we weave those three transits together, something really extraordinary appears. We have Chiron conjunct Saturn, which is the body. And before I even go down this route, actually, I want to stress that transits don't happen that often. These transits definitely do not happen that often. This is, when we say a perfect storm, this is a perfect storm in terms of astrology coming together and creating patterns, because we had Chiron conjunct Saturn, which is about the body reaching its limits. We had Jupiter conjunct Neptune, which is faith dissolving fear and expanding blind spots. And we had Neptune conjunct the South Node, karmic completion, spiritual relief, and a going home. So when we layer that on top of a Pluto-Venus astrocartography activation, a life lived in Neptune's realms, but relying far too heavily on the Mars aspect within that, and an identity focused with exposure and purpose, this wasn't just an accident in isolation. And energetically, this is a moment in time where the body was vulnerable, the soul was surrendered, and the spirit was already halfway somewhere else. So when people say Steve Irwin died doing what he loved, that is true. But astrologically, it also looks like he died at a moment when his body was open, his boundaries were dissolved, and his soul was already in a phase of release. So when I think about the story of Steve Irwin and how it asks us to reflect on how we relate to life, it really brings the story of courage to the surface. We celebrate bravery and we romanticize fearlessness, but we really talk about the cost of those things. And even the strongest bodies have limits. Even the brightest spirits are mortal. So purpose should light us up, not quietly burn us out. And this episode isn't about diminishing Steve's legacy. He didn't die doing something reckless. He died being exactly who he was. He was living his blueprint when he died, but it just so happened that this was an extremely vulnerable time for him to be living his blueprint without awareness of the patterns that were at play. His story really reminds us that passion still needs protection, that discernment is a real skill and we need to use it. We need to get better at sensing and trusting our instincts on things. And boundaries aren't weak, but they are preservation. That combination that comes together in Steve's chart, when we look at the natal chart, when we look at the transits and the timing that he was in, and then we look at the astrocartography and layer all that together, this was that perfect storm of things going on that were unavoidable, really, when we take into account everything that was going on at that time, when we also layer in the location. So I hope that you have enjoyed that episode. Thank you for listening. In the next episode of Truly Tragic Transits, we'll be exploring another deeply internal story, Avicii, and what it means to live a Pluto-ruled life under extraordinary pressures. Until then, keep an eye on the transits, because you never know what keys they might hold.